Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar, the ESG Agenda Beyond COVID-19. So my name is Loïc Lemarois, and I am the Marketing Manager here at Headspring. So this webinar is intended to be engaging, so please do send your comments, your questions by using the chat here, the chat function on the GoToWebinar application. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session. So yeah, please make sure to send your questions. I will make sure to answer them at the end. So today we're here with Paul Lewis. He's our editorial director at Headspring, and he will be the one moderating the session today. So hi, Paul, how are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well, thank you.
Welcome.
And welcome everybody, and I hope you are all safe and healthy and also able to work. These are genuinely extraordinary times, and particularly extraordinary for the workplace. So there couldn't really be a better time to discuss ESG and the coronavirus, because it's absolutely the vital thing here. So I think we're going to have quite an extraordinary discussion here. And let me introduce, before I kick off, let me introduce my two panelists. I have here Silvia Pavoni, who is the economics editor of The Banker, which most of you will probably know is part of the Financial Times. She's also a columnist on sustainable finance and environmental, social and governance risks, and is an honorary fellow of the economics department at City University in London. And is also an advisor of not-for-profit organization WIL, Women in Leadership in Latin America. So absolutely perfectly suited for this discussion. So thank you very much, Silvia, for joining. And I have here Joe DiVanna also on my digital panel. Joe is a jack of many trades, of all trades. He's a professor of strategy, of leadership and ESG. He's connected to several universities, including IE in Madrid, where he's an educator there as well, which is our joint venture partner, and runs a financial services think tank, and he's an advisor to many banks around the world on leadership, strategy and on ESG, and is also helping us develop our own ESG approach with our clients, which I'm sure will come up as part of this conversation as well. So let me just think about, why is this ESG, why is it so important? People are saying that ESG, well, it's now going on hold. I feel it's completely the opposite. I think now this COVID virus has thrown into very sharp relief what companies are doing. It's the classic dilemma, it's the classic test, which is on the one side, you know, we need to survive as a company. What do we do to survive? On the other side, what can we do to help society? How can we contribute to the fight against this virus? So those two things which run through all of ESG, you're trying to ride two horses. You're trying to align what's good for the company and what's good for society. You're trying to make them both work together wherever possible. And now you're faced with this incredible dilemma. And we've seen many companies step up. I mean, every day we're getting these incredible stories of companies across the sectors, from the banks to even I was reading about the tobacco manufacturers, to the pharmaceutical companies, the retailers, the logistics companies. I mean, just across the board, doing amazing things. But then you also have the good, you have the bad, and you have the ugly. You have some very sort of dodgy kind of activities amongst companies who are sort of almost riding this wave and trying to sort of almost exploit it. And then you have people who are just trying to survive. These are all the ESG issues sort of concentrated into one, and no more than that in the banking world. I think we're seeing stories, the good and the bad as well. Silvia, maybe you want to just give us a sense of what are the banks doing, what should they be doing, and what can they do?
So thank you, Paul, and thanks again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So I understand that the audience is mostly from a banking, financial services background and sector. So obviously we're going to target the discussion focusing on that, but I hope that anyone else who may not be from that sector will find this interesting anyway and anyway raise their hands virtually if there is anything that we haven't touched upon that you would like to hear from us. But to answer your question, I think what really this catastrophe has done is perhaps highlighted the importance of the G in ESG, so governance. Particularly when looking at banks and financial services, that the governance elements is always kind of considered as being dealt with already by the compliance function. So it had to do, a lot of it had to do with making sure that the banks, of course, didn't break any laws, that were compliant in terms of anti-money laundering regulation and so on, and also that shareholders' rights were respected, which is something that is, of course, very important. But the fact that we are also now, and very much so, particularly now, considering the wider society and stakeholders' needs, again, the governance has really changed, in my mind, the role that it plays within the ESG umbrella. And considering what everyone is doing from a corporate citizenship, I guess, point of view in this crisis is actually quite remarkable. And it also highlights the role that we place on banks. So perhaps even more so now, we may want to consider them as utilities because they are essential in the running of the economy. A lot of them, because of individually rising to the challenge, but also because of some pressures from policymakers, have enacted a series of measures from cutting salaries for and bonuses for the top management, to delaying or cancelling dividend payments, to, of course, freezing repayments on loans and credit cards, and earmarking emergency funding for small businesses in particular that might need it. So this, again, I think brings in a couple of elements, as I said, both the internal governance and the leadership that these institutions run on, and also the role that they play within society. So it's a moment really, I think, to readdress those two elements.
But we are hearing quite a few stories, certainly in the UK, sort of objections, and I want to know how much strength and merit there is that the loans and the government policy that's being channeled through the banks isn't necessarily going to reach the small businesses. What can you say about that? Is that a fair criticism now of the banks?
So we have to see how, of course, this funding will, the mechanism, the pipeline, right? So the piping of how this funding will reach the companies and the individuals, the employees. I think so. Hopefully that's going to work out. But of course, there are question marks in terms of the processes and delay as well, from when leaving essentially small companies and employees uncovered for maybe even a month, which is quite a lot if you have to pay rent and bills and buy food. But there is also another element, I think, to this, because even if let's assume that everything runs relatively smoothly, and that's also in addition to banks facilitating the enrichment of the fact that these funds will reach the economy and companies. There is also another element which has to do with these loans that are now being frozen, but that at some point will have to be repaid. So if we assume that the economy is going to bounce back, so there is going to be a bit of a V, so there is a dip and then straight back up, things are not going to be too challenging. If there is another letter that defines how the economy is going to look like for the next year, then things might be a little bit complicated. What if it is an L? So the economy dives and then it stays there for a little bit longer. And so no one will have any money really to repay these loans. And this again brings into the fore the role of banks. What should banks do? Should they cancel the debt? There are also institutions that are private sector institutions. They're not nationalized, of course, and they have shareholders to respond to. And in many cases, in some cases, at least, shareholders are probably also us, individuals. So it will be a very interesting situation to look, and hopefully we'll find the right solution, or the best possible solution in this case, considering again the role that financial institutions play and what governments really can do to protect the economy and the most vulnerable among us that are in this dire situation.
But yes, thanks very much. I mean, I think that covers a lot of the sort of the tricky issues that bankers are facing now. But there's this big sort of shadow from the 2008 financial crisis, which has it has huge sort of social connotations about how did the banks behave well during the crisis and immediately following the crisis. And I guess a lot of people view the sector now in that context. Did you deliver what was necessary for society then? Do you need to make up for it now? In that wider, I mean, you focus very much on the governance side of things, but in terms of that sort of social role, which you touched on as well, is that much more important now, given the historical context?
Well,
so
I think.
Oh, sorry, Joe, please.
Yeah,
Joe.
I think one thing we have to remember is that what this does is it really puts into very sharp contrast the role that banks play. Banks provide social financial cohesion, the glue that holds society together. That's why if one bank fails, everyone assumes all banks are going to fail. And that's why governments bail banks out. So here the banks are given, a once in a lifetime opportunity to do the right thing, and to really, look at a person's, debts and look at what they're trying to do, and kind of restructure things. Banks are good at restructuring, and what banks need to do now is innovate. We need to come up with some innovative solutions, that change as economic conditions change as well. But the role that banks play in society is often overlooked. It's not like automobile manufacturers or other types of durable goods creation. Banks play an essential role because money, and a person's finances are emotional. People are attached to these things. So the banks play a very different role in society than simply just facilitating transactions. It's more of an emotional thing than a mere business things. And I think the challenge is going to be is to see how senior bankers set the expectations of their shareholders. I think that's going to be the real key. And if we are the shareholders, then our expectations are if the bank's doing the right thing for society, then yeah, maybe we can afford to get fewer dividends. So it really, is a test of leadership, of how they're going to manage everyone's expectations and what steps and actions are they going to take, on the behalf of the bank itself and its role in society.
So this suggesting this is a really pivotal moment, not just looking back at what they've been saying about the ESG policies, but also looking forward. If you go ahead maybe sort of 5 to 10 years, maybe people are looking back to this moment and saying, well, what did you do in the great sort of Covid-19 crisis? When you talk about ESG, when you talk about helping society, this is the moment. So you're suggesting that they're sort of building from this point now, that the innovation, that sort of representing themselves is very much informed by how they innovate now.
Yeah, if you go back and look at the last financial crisis, people look at that and say, these were bankers doing banker things and got themselves into banker trouble, But this crisis is a crisis that comes from outside of the financial industry. It's an external, event that has occurred that it has created these economic conditions. So it's a completely different thing, than the last financial crisis. And so the banks have a very different role to play, and can really, step up and make a big change, in their role in society and repairing their image, that people had of them over the last 10 years, and really, do some things that would be amazing. And if you think of all the technologies that are available, to banks today, especially in the area of risk management, things like, managing customer lifetime value and socially indexed lending and these kinds of tools, banks have a nice palette of tools that they can do some really creative and innovative things, to help people through this time period without sacrificing profits. They can still make, a reasonable profit, by doing the right thing.
Silvia, do you think, is this a moment of opportunity then, not to be missed?
I always try not to use the word opportunity in this case, because we're still very much in the middle of such a tragic situation. But I know that many have been writing, ourselves included at the bank, about the fact that while banks were really at the epicenter of the financial crisis over a decade ago, they are now in a position to actually help. So from that perspective, from a purely reputational perspective, this is clearly a different moment.
What do you think they should do?
Sorry?
What do you think? I'm sorry to interrupt, but what do you think they should do then? What help do you think they can provide in the long term?
They already are doing, like many other private sector companies, and to a certain extent governments, they're already doing a fair bit. I'm sure there is more that they could do, and Joe has alluded to some things that they could look into. My main concern, however, is the economy. So it's, if the economy tanks as it is tanking and stays there, it's going to be very hard for anyone to really make money. And so that's when banks will really be tested. So it's fine to freeze on repayments now, because banks are much better capitalized now than they were a decade ago during the financial crisis. They have much stronger capital buffers, they have liquidity, they're in a much stronger position, so they can sustain this for a little while. The real test, I personally believe, will come when things will continue to be like that for a little bit longer, the economy hasn't picked up, and then that's when really banks will be faced by very tough choices. So do you continue to support that small business? And this is particularly relevant for Europe, where is it 90% over? I think 90%. Then of the economy is actually run by small businesses. So do you support those clients that are ailing, or do you close it up? And what's the tolerance for loss that your shareholders actually have? Shareholders of the bank have. So those are the tough questions, I think, and they are going to be faced by those in a few months.
I mean, this is a very interesting thing. I'll just pick up your Joe, your view about what they can do, what great innovations going forward. But it is very interesting when you look at the sort of the position that companies find themselves. Some really are in the heart of it. They're doing functions that absolutely are essential for keeping society moving, the economy moving. So you'll talk about sort of Amazon and the logistics companies and the healthcare service and the retailers. They're in the thick of it, and in a sense, you could say that their sort of social responsibilities lie in just doing their job well, just keep it going, doing it well, and covering themselves for any sort of difficult aspects. Whereas there'll be other companies that are not right in the mainstream of it, but they can go out of their way to sort of perhaps, produce ventilators or other medical equipment that isn't their mainstream business. They can go beyond, they can ally with other companies in their sector. So it really depends on where you are in society, whether or not your main sort of almost moral choice here is just do what you're doing. Do you think the banks sort of fit in with that? Just do what you're doing, do it well, do it responsibly, and that's the best thing you can do? Or is there something more, something really big that banks could perhaps think about over the 5 to 10 year period?
Well, I think banks and banking in general is a lot like electricity. You really notice it when it doesn't work and it's not on. So banking is essential. And providing people with credit, and access to funding and those things, are what banks do, and that's what keeps an economy moving. Just having access to capital is a big deal. So just doing that well, doing it efficiently, and keeping the lights on is an important factor that banks play. But also, banks now are presented with an environment where a lot of the knowledge that they had over the last 10 years with all these new technologies, give them an opportunity to kind of rethink a number of things. We've been on a big thing about closing branches and trying to get more people to do things electronically and that. Now we've sort of forced people. I had to go shopping in the last couple of days, and nobody takes cash anymore. They all want, electronic payments. So we suddenly thrust society into a brand new paradigm of doing things differently. People will want to return to the old paradigm, especially as this thing solves itself over time. But I think a large part of those people aren't going to return to the old paradigm. So banks now have been kind of struggling with how do we get people to convert over to electronic money, and how do we get people to do these things remotely. Well, it's all been thrust on us. Now what the banks need to do is to make people comfortable with that, to make people confident in what they're doing and how they're doing it, and that's an important thing. I mean, a lot of the emotional experience of bank transactions gets forgotten as we put them electronically. For example, I'll give you a real good example of this. There's one bank transaction that customers around the globe want to do in a branch. It's their first mortgage. It's a big number. There's lots of zeros on the paper. It's the most money they're going to spend in their life. They want to sit down with a human being, shake their hand, and look them in the eye, and know everything's going to be okay. Their second mortgage or refinancing, they'll do that electronically. But it's something about that one transaction, that human moment, that has to be captured in some way. So what we have to realize is that banks now have to sort of balance the equation. We just can't wipe out all the branches and go electronic. That's a nice dream. So banks are going to need to figure out how to rethink their customer service models, and do things, like we're doing now electronically, but be able to really cope with this new world, and the tools that they have available to them make it possible. It's just going to take a lot of creativity.
Yeah, I mean, there's a broader question here, which we hopefully we'll have time to cover later, which is, are we moving into a different way of doing business? Is this sort of catapulted us into a different, or is there going to be a backlash and people want more of the human interaction, more of the old way, because they've seen what it's like to be deprived of it? So, that's something. But before we do go on, we have some questions, I think, from some of the participants.
Yes, we do. And actually, so the question comes from somebody, and it's if we look at beyond banks, how can businesses look at the long term and play a social role?
So a social role. Yeah, so going on beyond the banks, what can other companies do in terms of a social role connected to COVID and beyond? I mean, is this, what?
So I'm curious also to hear what Joe thinks about this. But it's an interesting question because so particularly in certain parts of the world, let's think about the US. So the States, has to be small. Everything is in the hands of, or a lot of the activities in the hands of the private sector. And so if there is something like this happening, a lot of the response also seems to be coming necessarily from the private sector because the state wasn't there. Should it come from the private sector? Do we want a bigger state to ensure that services that have been run as following the mantra of excellency and efficiency mean that if there is an emergency, then they can't function in that way, because you need to have the stocks, you need to have a bigger capacity than the regular capacity that you would have under normal circumstances. So do we want a bigger state that is able to cope with these situations, but that is of course regularly more expensive? Or do we want to leave the dealing of the extraordinary and painful situations to private sector companies, which then are put under even more extraordinary pressure to cope with this, and that is then a bit of a patchy solution, right? So it's not coordinated. It's like company does this out of their own will, another company does that. So of course, in these circumstances, everyone pulls together from neighborhoods. My neighbors, they've all put together. At least we'll email each other to check on each other. If someone has a food shop delivery, we all ask whether anyone else needs anything else. So from that kind of sense of community to a broader sense of community that companies have with their customers and the countries where they're based and where they have operations. So it's an interesting question. What could companies do more? I'm not sure we need to leave it all in the hands of the private sector in this case. Of course, companies need to think about this, and this is really gathering everyone's minds in terms of the footprint that they leave on societies generally, not just in a situation of crisis. And this is one very painful example, but we can also think about climate change and the role that companies play in helping or making worse a situation that is already rather dire, although not all of us can feel the consequences of this as yet. So certainly I think this is heightening everyone's, it's putting everyone on alert and making us aware that things that were unthinkable only a couple of months ago are can be very much real. But then again, I'm not sure that all the responsibility should be left on the private sector. But I'm curious to hear what Joe thinks.
Yeah,
well,
Joe.
The one thing I think has happened is when we look at the ESG agenda, we've taken sustainability being, will the planet be here long term, and now suddenly sustainability has become internalized. You know, will my business be here in the future? Will I be sustainable? Will my activities be sustainable long term? So that's the first thing. We've had this flip occur, you know, very quickly, right? If I look at private sector versus, you know, bigger government, I've written a couple of books on this. I've always been a big fan of private sector, but we have to remember that sometimes the private sector doesn't always act in the best interest of the public. It has its own motivations because it wants to, you know, provide a benefit to its shareholders. And I always go back to remember Edmund Burke, the English economist, you know, who said capitalism is the unwavering belief that the wickedest of men will do the wickedest of things for the betterment of all mankind. You know, so we do have to realize that there's a different motivation in the private sector. That said, there are moments, you know, when the private sector does step up and do things that are extraordinary that governments can't do, you know, and they can do it more efficiently. So I think what this is testing is where that balance really sits, you know, and how can we collaborate, you know, together to do things. There was a good book written about 20 years ago called Co-opetition, you know, and I think we're starting to see what that model really looks like, you know, in today's world of how that's applied. And one of the things that I have been thinking about when we talk about, you know, people here, like in my neighborhood where I live, emails have gone around, you know, does anybody need groceries, and that we all come together during this time of hardship, right? But if you look at a place like Japan, you know, has done this thing when there isn't hardship. You know, there's a system in place where, say, part of the culture there is to take care of your parents when they're elderly. And say I live in Tokyo, but my parents are in Osaka, and I can't get there all the time. I can find an elderly couple in Tokyo and do things for them and earn so many points for that. And those points are redeemable by my parents in Osaka, who has someone there who can take them to the grocery store and take them and do things. And this system's been in place for the last 25, 30 years, you know, and it didn't take a catastrophe for that to happen, you know. So here in the West, we sort of create these things when extraordinary circumstances occur, you know, but in other cultures, it's part of the culture itself, you know. So I think here we have an opportunity to actually step back and look at, you know, what our role is, and especially in the area of small businesses, you know, how can I do things differently and still be profitable? You know, people keep thinking that doing the right things means, you know, sacrificing profits. I don't think so. I think if you do the right thing, people will appreciate that, you know, and they will help you preserve your profit margin. You know, in the neighborhood that I live in, there's a small, you know, mom and pop store here, you know, and there's been queues there. And my son went yesterday to buy some things, and the woman said, instead of waiting in the queue, just take it. You can pay me next week, or, you know, pay me some other time. You know, oh, that's extraordinary. You know, so we forget that the role that small businesses play, you know, in society hasn't really changed. They've been magnified now, you know, and we're now starting to look at things from a different perspective, which I think is good. I also think, you know, to kind of amplify some of the things you said earlier, is that I don't want to call it a backlash, but I think what will happen is as people are isolated, when the isolation is lifted, people want to meet, people want to be together, people are social, you know, people want to travel. You know, these things I think will jump back up, you know, very, very quickly. because we're social. Human beings are social people. And I think we're going to see things change. And I see the role that small business plays, which is a huge part of our economy, isn't really going to change. But I think the way we're going to interact with them will change. And I think banks have a unique opportunity to provide funding in a new way. The same as, I'll give you another good example without talking too long on this. Why do things like PayPal exist? PayPal exists because banks were lazy, right? If I was an SME and I wanted to take credit card payments, I had to guarantee them a certain transaction volume and pay a certain fee per month. PayPal came in and said, no, you don't need to do any of that stuff. We're going to, just provide you with this service for free, and then you'll pay a small transaction fee on that. Simple, no cash out, put up front. It made it absolutely simple for small businesses to comprehend it and do it. So theoretically, it shouldn't exist, but it does. Now what PayPal is doing with working capital loans is the same kind of thing. What PayPal has said is that if you have money coming in through PayPal and you are paying your bills through PayPal, we'll assess the difference, look at your cash flow, and we'll provide you with a working capital loan. And it's the same thing that banks do. But with a bank, there's a monthly payment. With PayPal, there's no monthly payment. What PayPal does is they take a small percentage of every transaction coming in your receivables to start paying down the loan. So they start getting repaid the very next day. So they've reduced the risk of lending to the SME market exponentially, and improve cash flows, because a lot of times with SMEs, that monthly payment is due when they're having a cash dip. So now they're in trouble. Now they're behind on their payments. So eliminating the monthly payment helps smooth out the cash flow, for thousands of SMEs and change their business models. Yeah. So, banks now have this opportunity that banks could have been doing this for the last 30 years. They had the technology, but not the innovative thought, to kind of rethink the model.
Yeah, I think in payments, there's definitely an area where we have seen, and will definitely continue to see lots of new players coming in and kind of nibble around the edges, if not taking a big chunk of the pie.
Yeah.
From banks, and potentially other technology firms may actually come in and not just work in payments, but also in financing working capital and any other kind of financing. We're seeing this already with some of the big technology platforms, particularly in Asia and China, where they create supply chain finance and so on, and they have the right technology, the right data, a lot of data which banks do not have. So I guess that might also mean that banks thinking about the skills that banks will need for the future workforce, but also thinking about their ESG teams. They probably want to get more tech guys involved, more data scientists, more people that can think about the technological infrastructure and changing the business model so that it meets not only the technological changes that we were facing anyway and witnessing anyway, and but also what those changes mean to the wider society and the needs that there is now for them to really happen.
Yeah, let's just dwell on this issue about what it means for individuals. I think, Joe, you've given us some very good examples in your neighborhood, but also in terms of the kind of skills we're going to need. How is this going to affect the way we work? We're obviously seeing this shift to webinars and digital interactions. But in the long term, are we going to get this need to have much more of a sort of face-to-face thing? We've sort of realized how important it is. Are we going to need new skills where it's about digital competence? Where, from the individual's point of view, not just within the banks generally, how is this crisis going to change the way we view our role at work?
Well, I think one thing's going to be an interesting topic, is distance leadership. How do you interact with your employees? How do you give direction? How do you be a leader in this new environment? Is going to be a very fascinating area of study, because we're not going to get it right the first time. We're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way. Just being able to direct, activities which require physical presence when the leader or people in that particular group are now physically separated. It changes the dynamics. If you look at the last 20 years of people sort of working from home, people feel sort of left out of the loop when they're at home. They feel that there's conversations happening in the office that they're no longer part of. So they feel a bit left out and isolated. So the way we interact is going to change. But then again, the other thing to think about, and this is something I was reading yesterday, is there a novelty factor? Will this novelty wear off? If it impacts productivity. So, if the overall implication is the productivity of the organization dropped by 20%, the novelty will wear off very quickly. So I think we have to understand how to use these technologies, to lead organizations differently, but also to maintain a higher level of productivity than in the past. If we just reach parity with our productivity of the past using the technology, we haven't really gained anything except we've eliminated the commute to work, which is a big factor if you think about pollution and all those kinds of, and time, the loss of time. So that in and of itself is a good change. Okay? But we have to be able to use it to go beyond where we are today and become more efficient. And whether that's I talked with one bank who are now doing their CEO does a daily broadcast. It's a 5-minute video that he does every day, and says, here's the state of the bank. And it's just to let the employees know what he's thinking. And that's fantastic. My question was, why haven't you been doing that for the last 10 years? Why wait till now to do that? So people have the right ideas, but in the past, they've been sort of not able to implement them because maybe they didn't feel comfortable doing it. But now they are sort of experimenting with these things. And so I think it's going to change the nature of how we do things.
And what about the soft skills in all of this? So much of the sort of emotional intelligence around meetings, around discussions, around relationships at work, they've sort of taken a step back. This is sort of becoming more digital relationships. How does one develop the kind of issues of empathy where you have a slightly sort of constricted way of working with your colleagues? I mean, it's very hard. You don't know. You can be cut off 1 second to the next. You don't know. You're not sure whether this conversation is going to continue. How do you develop those kind of soft skills that actually work in this? And that's assuming we don't go back and there isn't that sort of move back to much more of a sociable way of working. What are these skills that we need to be looking at? Well, we understand the digital skills. What about the other skills?
So I think, how quickly we go back to our traditional way of working will depend on how long this will last, because probably one of the biggest changes, if this really lasts for a little bit longer, is that we may enjoy staying at home a little bit longer, working from home maybe more frequently and avoiding the commute. And so that will improve our, balance, work-life balance. Assuming that we also do have a right place where to work, a suitable place where to work at home. So assuming that this will continue for a little bit longer, perhaps the focus that we put on the sort of domestic real estate will be more important than the one we place on the commercial real estate. So how comfortable our houses will be and how well set up they will probably be more important than how nice and snazzy and how many pods you may have in or coffee area you may have in the office. So that's making the assumption that things will stay as they are for a little bit longer. In terms of productivity, there is a big question mark because again, our houses are not set up to really also function as offices, as homeschooling areas, as places where families spend the whole of their day together. In terms of the soft skills, I think that really brings to the fore the importance of having good people managers. And often people lament that maybe the managers are put there, but they're not necessarily good at managing people. They're good because they've had perhaps a good track record in deal making, or they're just good at playing internal politics, who knows, but they're not necessarily good people managers. And so not physically being in the same place and dealing with the stresses that we all deal with will definitely highlight the importance of having someone who actually is good at dealing with people. Now, how you improve that, I'm not quite sure, but that probably will highlight the role that those people that already potentially exist within teams. I'm sure there are many teams where there are good, people who are good at managing others and have empathy and know the rest. And so this will probably highlight their importance within the team. What would you assume? It's an interesting question for the staffing managers, for the HR managers, for the learning and development managers, how they intend to how they're working on this, what kind of challenges they see, and if there are any watching us, it would be interesting to also to hear what they think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please do comment. Please do put any questions in if there's anything you want to ask and for us to discuss and talk about, because this is a massive area. I mean, a lot of home working has been about efficiency and sort of cutting the fat, so to speak. But I'm wondering, maybe we've done too much of that, and that as we develop more home working as part of mainstream business, maybe you have to think about it in terms of the buffers, in terms of what happens when things go wrong. And in particular, is this crisis just sort of a preparation for the next one? That actually, rather than just let's survive it and get back and develop, actually there may be another one next year from a completely different, it may not be a virus, maybe something else. And maybe we need a lot more sort of buffers in the system and more flexibility in the system, and that's what we should be looking at strategically. Joe, what do you have a view on that?
Well, I think Silvia said something that I think is really important. She said the word empathy, and I think that's one skill that the leaders need to have during this time period. I'm working with one CEO who works with a very small organization, and what he's worried about is making sure everyone's okay at home, that they see each other every day, via technology, they talk to each other and all that. Whereas at the same time, the CFO is worried about how we're going to make payroll in 6 months. It's a whole different worry. And when these two were talking, you can see the sort of tension between them. And the CEO said, listen, I don't have time to worry about the money now. I want to make sure that my people are all okay, my people are taken care of and all of that. And he says, I have a lot of smart people working for me. We'll figure out how to make money during the next 6 months. And I think that's a key thing. It wasn't, he wasn't looking at it as it's his responsibility singularly to figure out how to make money and move the organization forward. He says, I'm depending on my people who are smart. They'll figure this out, and I'm going to give them, enough support so that they can figure it out. And I think that's a really interesting concept, to be able to look at your organization and say, I hired smart people. Now let me use their smarts, to kind of help get us through this. So I think the difference in his leadership style is it's not top down. He's not looking at the senior team to come up with all the answers. He's putting the questions to his entire organization and letting them figure things out and bring it up to the senior team, that type of thing. So I think that's a really good model, and he's very empathetic. He's much more worried about people doing homeschooling, and childcare and those kinds of things. Those are the issues that's on his mind that's keeping him awake at night. And he realizes that the money problem is the CFO's problem. They're going to talk about it or whatever. But right now he's focused on this, his organization. Because if he keeps the organization healthy and happy, they will come up with the solution. I think that's an important thing that we often, as leaders forget, that we have to have that level of empathy, to really understand our people and to trust that the fact that they're going to do the right thing.
So the orientation of the leader, you're saying, is absolutely crucial as we go forward. Are you looking at, is it very much about, looking after staff and hoping that will solve the problems ahead? Or, if you're much more of a strategic sort of thinker, especially when it comes to ESG, you're kind of looking at saying, going back to this question about what should companies do, you have to think about, the profitability, the sustainability, the survivability of the business, and this new world where the expectations have changed and behaviors have changed. So I guess the question really is what sort of questions, what principles would you apply as companies start rethinking their ESG approach? Everything you've said points to a very different type of world. What are the key points you should now apply? I mean, I'm thinking about, as you say, the way you manage staff, the empathy that you introduce, the kind of impact that you're going to be having on society, whether you see actually that you have this much more important social role, and the kind of engaging of everybody. I mean, for us, when we talk to clients, it's about engage everybody in the company in your ESG activities. It seems that that's probably a much more important factor now.
Yeah, I think that the real challenge will be, for traditional leaders to kind of rethink, how they engage the organization, to change from being a control point, which most leaders tend to be, to becoming a resource to be consumed by the organization. So pushing decisions down into the organization and only letting the exceptions come up to the leader, I think is one thing that's going to really change. And the more I talk to him about his role, where he says, I've hired talented people, let's use their talents now. I think we often forget that we hire people because we want them to fill a job slot, and we sort of have commoditized their skills, so that we're doing certain things for certain activities, but we forget people are very creative. People do have the ability to innovate, and now's the chance for us to, I don't want to say capitalize on it, but now's the chance for us to create the right environment for people to solve a lot of these problems. One of the groups I've been talking to over the last couple of days have this big problem with homeschooling, right? So what they're doing is one person is really good at helping their child with math, so they're setting up like a webinar like this so that she can spend 45 minutes a day with 4 or 5 of her coworkers' children, and talking about math problems. They're studying for their GCSEs and things like that. And that's a creative solution, and the company's giving her time, to do that and explore helping other employees. So I think it's extraordinary to see, how creative an organization can be given the right environment and given the right motivation by the senior team to do some things like this and experiment and come up with new solutions.
So here's a participant's question. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, sorry. Just to say, I think flexibility is definitely very important. So having a structure and top managers who understand the importance of being flexible, and both Joe and myself speak to so many people and bankers and bank CEOs. So you can tell the ones that after a long chat with them, the ones that do have that kind of top-down approach by which they want to be flexible in the work, and therefore the whole organization is, and some others that perhaps only keep flexibility to a bare minimum because people need to be in the office, which is a big issue, particularly when you consider the other logistical constraints that we all have to deal with. Again, homeschooling, when you have to take the children back to school, then the school run, and still then having to show face in the office. That's one big impediment, particularly when considering gender issues and ensuring that more women are part of still a male-dominated industry such as the financial services one. So flexibility is definitely very important, and I do hope that that's one of the features that will stay in the sector, in the whole economy when possible. And we also have to say that we are very lucky because we can do these kind of things. We can work from home. We can talk to each other via online platforms. We don't make things with our hands, so we don't have to go to the factory and create a component. So we are the lucky ones, actually.
We are. Yes, it's a very different situation for people who work in offices. Another question from a participant, Loic.
Yes, so this crisis, is it a great opportunity actually for business to push on diversity?
Yes, but I guess as we were saying, perhaps it is, because again, some of the, it's an old-fashioned way of looking at things, but statistically we can see, and anecdotally also, talking to bankers, usually taking children to school tends to be, or if the children are sick, it tends to be the woman's job. Not always, and things are improving. So again, I don't want to generalize too much, but so being able to then work from home means that you skip a lot of you skip the commute to get to the office, so you can in theory be there ready to work. And I know that's one of the issues that traders were looking into when considering reducing trading hours, so starting later in the day, so that people who do have children, need to take them to school, can be ready in time, by also sort of doing their duty as parents. So perhaps if we all cut commutes, it means that in that sense, we are going to increase in a little bit in terms of productivity, but definitely in terms of work-life balance.
And
there are aspects of commuting though that I do miss. I mean, I really enjoy, getting on the train every day and getting a cup of coffee, read the paper, get to the office, and that part I miss.
From the kitchen. You can commute from the study to the kitchen.
Well, but it's an interesting point, is that no matter what the sort of logistical obstacles are, we find a way around it, we integrate it, we actually make up, this is not dead time that when you're commuting into work. And likewise, there are problems working at home. But this issue of diversity, I think, is very interesting, because the way that the workplace is set up and hasn't taken into consideration so much people's sort of personal lives and how it's sorted out. And I'm just wondering, there's another question, maybe for Joe, about, well, both of you actually, about KPIs. I mean, is ESG forcing us to change the way we rate our work performance? I mean, are there any things that you'd expect to change in terms of our KPIs now?
Oh, absolutely. This actually is a really good time to really sit down as a senior team and rethink an organization's KPIs. What exactly are we measuring, and what's the value of that measurement against our customer value proposition? And I don't mean just simple KPIs. I mean, looking at all of our KPIs to kind of figure out exactly, what are we measuring? And I'll give you a good example of this. There's a bank over in Denmark. Most banks, measure the number of products that customers have. Okay, the cross-sell ratio, right? They've eliminated that. Okay, because they repackaged their products so that the cross-sell ratio is always 6, right? So when you sign up to the bank, you get 6 products. You get savings account, checking account, credit card, all of that. You get 6 products as a bundle, right? So they've eliminated that KPI. But what they've learned by doing that is that having a higher cross-sell ratio doesn't guarantee profitability. People have to use those products, have to have transaction volume in order for the bank to actually make money on it. So what they've done is they've eliminated one KPI, but they discovered a new KPI in the process. So I think our opportunity right now is to kind of look at all our KPIs, say, okay, do they still make sense in the new business model? Because a lot of our KPIs that we have today, in fact, one bank that I worked with last year in Canada, we sat down and made a list of all the KPIs the bank had, and then we had the managers figure out the dates those KPIs went into place. Almost all of them were from the 1980s. And we asked ourselves, has the world changed since 1980? The answer was yes. So why are we measuring the same old stuff? So I think this gives us a really good chance to kind of rethink our KPIs, look at, say, exactly what are we measuring? And, and how does that work? We're still measuring branch performance at banks, the same way that reflects the customer's lifestyles today. So it's a really good time to sit down as a senior management team and kind of rethink not only our organization and our business model, but how we're going to account for all of it, how we're going to measure it.
I mean, Silvia, when you're talking about the diversity and the way we're restructuring our daily work and all the complications, I mean, that must also affect how we're, how our performance is rated, because it's not a strict sort of 9 to 5. I mean, you're going to be juggling lots of home stuff as well, which could be an advantage. I mean, it could be a good thing, but how would you imagine that a new KPI would be brought into the way, our performance.
No, absolutely, and it depends very much on the job that you do. So just looking at my example as a journalist, so if I work on and we do tend to work on long features, so you have a longer lead time to put together your articles, which are thorough research, but it means that I can break down my day flexibly. I don't need to churn out news, and they have to be out as the news break, right? So it depends on the kind of job that you do, but so not all jobs will be suitable, I guess, to have that flexibility built in. But for the ones that are suitable, this really highlights the importance and really raises the question, why aren't they more flexible? And as Joe was saying, perhaps we are still stuck in a very old mentality, and not just when it comes to products and KPIs, but also in terms of how we live our work lives.
So this really could be a trigger for a genuine rethink about it. I mean, it's extraordinary that
I think so. For the jobs where there isn't a real need to be in the office, or to be in the office or work from a certain hour to another certain hour, but it's just because that's the culture of the place. I think this is really going to make people think long and hard about the need for that culture and whether we need to change that culture.
I think we've got time for just one last question, Loic.
Exactly. So just to close this conversation, does the situation with COVID-19 represent the end of capitalism as we know it today?
Okay, so since we're running out of time, let's think about that in terms of a prediction for the next sort of 5 years. So if you answer that with a prediction about where you think things will be in 5 years' time.
That's not fair.
And not only that, the challenge is to do it in 1 or 2 sentences. As an easy task for you.
That's a book to be written.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we can answer. I'm not sure we can.
Capitalism as we know it. I mean, look, clearly it's thrown into this relief about this relationship between companies and society. That has to change, I'm sure. And because they're so interdependent. And I would have thought that companies are now going to try to move as fast as possible to that strategic point where they know their role in society is very, very positive, and they know that that is what's going to sustain the business. They're going to move from the sort of firefighting, staying alive, or just stepping into a crisis to help society, to something that's much more sort of aligned. That what we do, what our business model is also about, is very, very good for society, and we've worked it through. I think that's where companies will be heading, which is a refashioning of capitalism, you could say.
I think that it definitely highlights the needs and the importance of community, what community means for financial services as well. And there is an excellent book by Raghuram Rajan, who is the former central bank governor of the State Bank of India, who looks exactly at this, the third pillar, so the community, and how financial services really need to look at that and be based on the services that they can provide to the community.
Joe, last prediction?
Well, I don't think it's the end of capitalism. I think that we're going to see a new variation of capitalism. And I've heard people talk about this as a revolution. And if we think about the word revolution, it means to go back to something. And yesterday I was reading the Lloyd's Bank Branch Manager's Handbook of the year 1874. And the branch manager there, it says, if you're going to write a loan, you have to understand your customer, their family, their status in society, how they interact with their neighbors. It spells all of this out. Things that we have tried to computerize today, the same tick boxes. There, the branch manager had to use, their intelligence to kind of figure out, is this the right thing to do? So we're actually going back to that model of understanding, people's roles in society and how things kind of fit together. So it's
reaffirm our faith. Reaffirm our faith in individuals and their judgment, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
But let's not forget that in the general rush forward for sort of digital transformation. All right, look, we've run out of time. This has been a very, very interesting, fascinating conversation. we can go on and on for many hours, which of course we can't. I just want to thank you both. I thank all the participants for the questions and for listening. I wish you health, security, safety, and just a very prosperous sort of life over the next few weeks and months and years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do something fun.
Thank you very much for this session. It was very, very interesting. If you found this webinar interesting, please sign to our newsletter, because we're running webinars every week on topics that are similar or topics that are quite close to what we offer. So please make sure to sign to our newsletter to know which are the upcoming webinars. Thank you very much, guys, for the session. And to the people on the line, please be safe and have a wonderful day.
Bye.
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 Cheers.
I think we're done. Are we done? Yep.
I think we're done.
Joe, thank you very much. Silvia's
Yes.
gone. We'll talk again. Yeah, they're really good. There's so much to talk